I'm Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm convener of Middle East Studies Forum. I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers, and we'll go in the order of my introduction. Professor Bill Maley, Dr. Timur Sharan, and Dr. Naratullah Ibrahimi. I've had the pleasure of knowing Professor Bill Maley for years. I think probably maybe almost 3 decades, almost. Bill has been a long-standing scholar of Afghanistan, international law. He is very much involved with the Red Cross, and so he has many, many hats. But for the purpose of this talk today, Dr. Bill Maley is Professor of Diplomacy at Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy, ANU. He's a member of Australia and also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Bill is a very prolific author and researcher. He has so many books to his name, it will take us all day just to list the titles. But I'll just highlight a few. Rescuing Afghanistan, 2006. The Afghanistan War, 2009. Transition in Afghanistan, Hopes, Despair, and Limits of State Building, 2018. And the latest book that I think we have copies of is co-authored with our colleague here, Dr. Naratullah Ibrahimi, on Afghanistan Politics of Economics in a Globalizing State. So Bill will start the talk. We are going to have very brief statements because of the time. We need to keep it quite contained, and there's going to be plenty of time for conversation and Q&A, because I think that's really important for us to explore and hear from the floor as well. Then we'll go to Dr. Timur Sharan, who is currently a visiting fellow at ANU, working on a book titled International Intervention and State Building in Post-2001 Afghanistan, Lessons Learned. He was Deputy Minister for Policy and Programs at the Directorate of Local Governments in the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Prior to joining government, he was Senior Policy Analyst for Afghanistan at the International Crisis Group in Kabul. Welcome to Australia. Delighted to have you. So Dr. Timur is here on a short-term fellowship. Just under 2 months, I believe, mostly spent at ANU, but we're very lucky that he has visited us and graced us with his visit. Thank you very much for your presence. And then we move to our colleague here at ADI, Dr. Naratullah Ibrahimi, who's been working with us for a couple of years now on Afghanistan-related research projects. He's a research fellow at Alfred Deakin Institute, as I mentioned, and has finished his PhD with Professor Bill Maley, so it's like a family reunion. He has published 2 books, The Hazaras, and also Afghan State, Rebellion, Exclusion, and Struggle for Recognition. And of course, I'm sorry, I should have said 3 books. I'm a bit behind. This is number 3.
Number 2.
Number 2.
Yeah.
So I'm delighted to welcome you all to ADI. We are going to look at the peace process, what's happening in Afghanistan, as you will have followed the news. There are talks with the Taliban. That's going to have major implications. There are people who are for, people who are against. There are people who will be affected directly with the peace process if Taliban is somehow brought back into some kind of a national reconciliation government. So many issues and aspects to explore. So with that very brief introduction, I'd like to invite Professor Bill Maley to start. 10 minutes each, and then we go to Q&A. Please.
Sharan, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity not only to participate in this panel, but also to be able to share thoughts with colleagues at Deakin University, which has become very much a spotlight for focus of serious attention on the Middle East. Part of the occasion for our being here is Dr. Sharan's visit to Australia, which has enriched us very greatly. And another is the release of this new book that Dr. Ibrahimi and I have written on Afghanistan. And I wanted to begin by reading to you the dedication of this book, because it actually helps frame some of the issues that we'll be discussing in the panel. On the 17th of August 2019, one of the authors took part in a conference at the Afghanistan Centre at Kabul University, timed to mark the 100th anniversary of Afghan independence. The majority of the speakers were young Afghan researchers who presented papers of outstanding quality, and at the end of the day, the participants adjourned for a convivial dinner at a nearby restaurant. On the same evening, in a part of Kabul not far from the university, families and friends gathered to celebrate the wedding of a young couple, Mirwais Salani, 25, and Raihana, 18. The wedding invitations proposed a celebration with a world of hope and desire. At around 11:40 p.m, a suicide bomber detonated an explosive charge in the midst of the guests, killing 80 and wounding 180. The dead included 14 members of the bride's family. Responsibility was claimed by the Islamic State terrorist group in pursuit of its fanatical hostility to Shiite Muslims. In a heartbreaking statement, Mirwais said, "I was supposed to return happy, but within a span of 2 hours they devastated my whole life. They devastated my life within seconds. We had done nothing wrong to anyone, but our lives were devastated." In today's Afghanistan, hope and horror walk side by side. We dedicate this book to the innocent victims of terror in Afghanistan. Now, I share that at the outset of my remarks because I think it exposes very powerfully why it is that peace is something which matters for ordinary people in Afghanistan. It's not an abstract value, it's something which is profoundly central to people's aspirations for a safe, secure, stable, meaningful future. But at the same time, there are a number of features of the existing processes of discussion that being pursued just at the moment that need to be fleshed out in order to understand the limitations of such processes in generating the kind of peace that people within Afghanistan actually aspire to attain. Not all peace processes are peace processes. Sometimes the label is used in a fairly surreptitious fashion to try to disguise processes that are actually directed at quite different outcomes and objectives. There's a real sense in which the process which is being pursued at the moment is a withdrawal process rather than a peace process. And here there are echoes of the past when the negotiator involved was not Dr. Zalmay Khalilzad but Diego Cordovez of Ecuador, who masterminded UN negotiations in Geneva in the 1980s that led to the Geneva Accords of April 1988 that provided for the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan, but did not put in place a set of arrangements that would actually provide for stable peace in the future in Afghanistan. And instead, that particular peace agreement, despite being much played up by the Secretary General of the United Nations, in fact remitted Afghanistan's political future to the battlefield with devastating consequences for lots of people. A second point that I'd like to make is that in severely disrupted states and societies, stable and durable peace is unlikely to result from rabbit out of a hat approaches. It's very, very difficult to fast track a peace process in an environment where decades of conflict have led to an accumulation of complex issues that need to be unpicked and addressed effectively if one is to generate a stable environment for a political future. And there are several factors that account for the failure of fast-track mechanisms on the whole to work. One is that when you have had decades of conflict in a country, very often you have actors who project radically different visions of what the future in their view should be like. It's simply not the case that there is in Afghanistan a broad consensus over what the ends of politics should be in terms of social organisation, the power of the state, all these kind of things, as opposed to a very vague sense that it would be nice to have peace. And yet, when it comes to negotiations, these differing visions, a vision of an emirate, a vision of a democratic society, are likely to come sharply into conflict with each other. A second problem is that when you have decades of conflict, you are likely to have exceptionally low levels of interpersonal trust between participants in a negotiation process. Now, this typically is addressed by negotiators through agenda setting in a way that puts the easiest issues first on the table in the hope that one can build confidence between the parties and restore some degree of trust before one gets to the really tough questions. But as the Oslo process showed years ago, there's no particular guarantee that that's going to build enough trust to get through the tough questions when they come up, because very often the relevant actors are not those who are negotiating in a negotiating room, but the principals who are sitting somewhere else with objectives of their own that they're not keen to see negotiators compromise in any particular way. A third problem, and it's almost an epistemological problem, is that whilst groups that are participating in negotiations may try to signal that they are very different actors from what they might have been in the past, it's only when they actually get close to real power that one can test that proposition. It's very, very easy for well-trained negotiators to say we're not going to be like we were from 1996 to 2001 or whatever. But the real test comes if and only if they obtain access to power, and it pays to be sceptical about the disposition of people that reject themselves as reformed when the rewards for projecting such views are high and the costs are low. A third point that I would like to share is that processes of peacemaking are not confined to this phase of negotiations that result in an agreement. There's a lot of literature that suggests that the real crunch comes at the implementation phase. The classic warning sign here came with the Rwandan genocide of April to June 1994, in which at least 800,000 people were killed in a 3-month period. That followed the conclusion of a set of peace accords with respect to Rwanda, the Arusha Accords that had been negotiated under the auspices of an African negotiating team, exceptionally well versed in the complexities of the situation, but not able to overcome the problems of suspicion and distrust that still separated the different parties. And this led Professor Barbara Walter of the University of California at San Diego to argue very persuasively in a book called Committing to Peace that where you have extremely low levels of trust between parties and historically high levels of antagonism, unless you have a neutral security force, it can be exceedingly dangerous at the implementation phase to try to put peace in place. No one at the moment is putting up their hand to be part of a neutral security force in Afghanistan should the United States and its allies withdraw from the theatre. Now, at the worst, a peace process can actually trigger a disintegrative cascade even before one gets to the point of an agreement being signed. Because what's often overlooked is that the people who are witnessing negotiations are not just people who are in the chamber where negotiations occur. It's everybody who's seeing a report about what might be going on in the negotiation process. And this reporting can actually lead people to reposition themselves in order to ensure that they are in what seems to them the safest position before crunch time comes. And this has been theorised by writers like Timur Kuran and Cass Sunstein in their work on cascades, where they note that actors may well not like a particular force like the Taliban, but calculate that it's in their interest to shift to the side of such a force because it doesn't pay to be on the losing side and to be seen to be on the losing side in Afghanistan. And if one looks at how regimes have changed in Afghanistan in the last 30 years, the collapse of the communist regime of Dr. Najibullah and the collapse of the Taliban regime in November 2001 came about not because opposing forces ground their way to the centre of Kabul, but because actors repositioned themselves. This means that the mass psychology that surrounds a negotiation process is actually centrally important in order to prevent a sudden collapse that the negotiators have not had in their minds or anticipated. And here, I think Thomas Hobbes's observation in Leviathan from 1651 that reputation of power is a very important warning about the dangers that can be associated with ill-devised processes. One of my most ferocious criticisms of the approach that the United States has taken to dealing with the Taliban is that their conscious policy to exclude the government of Afghanistan from the negotiating table has enhanced the reputation of the Taliban and diminished the reputation of the Afghan government in a very dangerous way. Not least because the United States, in the course of the process, has shifted its position in such a way as to send the signal that they're giving and giving to the Taliban in exchange for virtually nothing coming back. And this is poor negotiation tactics, wearing my hat as a professor of diplomacy. The final point that I'd like to make is that negotiations conducted in the absence of the recognised government of a state virtually never work. They tend to lead to poor outcomes. And the two classic examples were the September 1938 negotiations in Munich over the fate of Czechoslovakia, conducted by Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain and Daladier in the absence of Czechoslovak representatives who were in the town but not allowed into the negotiations. The other example was the Paris Accords on Vietnam of 1973, and in each of these cases, within 2 years, a significant conflict had occurred which undid all the promise of the agreements that had been signed both in Munich and in Paris. And this, the other reason that this is a very dangerous kind of approach to take is that whilst in some circumstances you may be able to sell out a power without any cost, this is not always the case. And my final point is the following. Just before President Trump initially pulled the rug from under the negotiations that Dr. Khalilzad was conducting with the Taliban on the 7th of September, something very interesting occurred that got very little attention. And that was that the Americans agreed to the issue of release of Taliban prisoners in the custody of the Afghan government being put on the agenda of discussions. Now, the United States may not have realised this, but the effect was to deal the Afghan government back into the room as a veto player. Because this was one area where the United States unilaterally could not deliver on any promises that it might have made. It was hardly in a position to break its way into an Afghan prison and flood the streets with Taliban prisoners. And this didn't get much attention at the time because shortly afterwards the whole process unravelled for a period. But it remains something that's very significant in the process. And if you have sensed from press reporting that the negotiations between the United States and the Taliban have stalled in recent weeks, you would not be wrong. My suspicion of this is one of the factors, along with the whole issue of cessation of violence and a ceasefire, that has come up as a very difficult issue that can't simply be resolved by the people who are sitting around the table at the moment. So I think we're at an interesting phase in negotiation in Afghanistan. We are still very far away from any kind of agreement or process that is likely to deliver stable peace for the tortured people of that country. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Timur, please.
Well, thank you so much for Dr. Akbar for having us here. Such a pleasure to be here in Australia and Deakin University. And let me congratulate both my colleagues for their fantastic book, which I think everyone in Afghanistan should read as a textbook book. Maybe I begin by providing a brief update on what has happened so far, where we stand in relation to the ongoing negotiation between the Taliban and the United States, and then discuss implications and concerns from an Afghan point of view for the future of Afghanistan, both in terms of its polity and society. and possibly discuss, if time permits, possible scenarios in post-peace agreement with the US. There was 9 rounds of discussion between the US and the Taliban until September 2019, which there was almost a decision made to sign the agreement, and that the agreement would be signed in Camp David in the US, when the Taliban surprised the US by not going to Camp David, and that broke down the process. But the process has resumed. This has been in making for the past 1.5 years. This started in June 2018 after the Eid ceasefire, which was an Afghan government initiative by President Ghani, appealing to the Taliban to accept a 3-day ceasefire, which they did, and that opened the space for the US and other international partners to actually take the peace seriously. Now, there has been a lot of interviews. There was expectation that by end of January we'll reach a peace deal. It hasn't happened. Zalmay Khalilzad was in Kabul last night. There were several meetings, and it seems that we are nowhere close to signing a deal between the US and the Taliban. And the main reason is the definition of reduction of violence. And that takes me to the second issue, which is the framework that the Americans have proposed. Initially, the Americans said nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And that included 4 key processes, 4 key components. US withdrawal, Taliban guarantee that the international terrorist organizations, and there are more than 25 operating in Afghanistan, would guarantee that they would no longer operate and they would not provide that assistance. That was the second. The third one was the ceasefire, and the fourth one was the intra-Afghan dialogue. However, what happened after only a few meetings, the US government decided, the US negotiation team decided that this could be only a 2 process frame, that framework could be reduced to 2. And that is US withdrawal and guarantees from the Taliban that the international terrorists will not operate from Afghan soil. The 2, both ceasefire and intra-Afghan dialogue, has then moved to a later stage. To us, this is essentially a withdrawal agreement, not a peace agreement. This is what Professor Meili has hinted is South Vietnam 1972. They're desperate. It seems that the US is desperate to leave. There is a lack of transparency with both the Afghans and also other international partners about the process itself. There has been a lot of frustration by the European and other colleagues, international partners, about the lack of information sharing by the negotiating team. The unpredictability of a president in the US that can withhold a process that has been going on for months in a single tweet is threatening, is dangerous. And that shows the fate of a country, a nation, in the hands of a process that is unfortunately being reflected in tweets and in secrecy, in complete secrecy. Within that point, we think US does not know what it wants. It is not clear what it wants. It cannot define, it has been ambiguous about its definition of what reduction of violence means in Afghanistan. Does this mean the Taliban will only attack the rural parts of the country but not the cities? Does this mean that the Taliban will agree only not to attack the American forces but continue attacking the NDSF? And let's remember that the US sacrifice in Afghanistan in terms of number of soldiers has been around 3,000. Whereas the Afghan NDSF, Afghan National Defense Security Forces, has been around 64,000 in post-2001 Afghanistan. Let me talk briefly about assumptions and narratives. The narrative that is proposed is that the Taliban has changed. There is now we have Taliban 1, Taliban 2. That the Taliban 2 is now a new generation. I was in Doha a couple of months ago. From the discussion that we had, there is fundamentally no changes when it comes to human rights, values, expression of freedom, women's rights in Taliban's view as a whole. They are still a violent group and use violence as a means through which they achieve their goal. Not only that, it's embarrassing to be in Doha and see the arrogance of a violent group, that they see themselves completely victorious. That we are victorious thanks to Almighty God, our jihad was right, we have defeated the Americans and now they're leaving. Let's get it signed. And that to me is the biggest sacrifice that we could possibly do in the last 18 years in terms of blood and treasure. The second narrative or assumption is that that the Afghan government controls urban centers and the Taliban are controlling the rural Afghanistan. Therefore, the Afghan government or Afghanistan or the new generation like myself, we are not representing the country as a whole. And that itself is wrong, because the last year's survey of the Asia Foundation survey of Afghan people showed that 82.5% of Afghan population, both rural and urban, do not believe in the value system that the Taliban are proposing. And that number has increased this year. The third assumption is that Pakistan has changed, that there is a change of leadership, that they're honest about this process. To me, I argue otherwise. Trusting Pakistan itself is the wrong assumption and is the wrong starting point. And it seems right now that the Pakistanis are selling this whole thing as a favor to the US, that we are doing you a favor by bringing the Taliban on board. The Afghan government's narrative has been we are defending the republic, the constitution, and there are preconditions, and ceasefire has been the precondition for us to enter the inter-Afghan dialogue. But the Taliban are not committing to that. In fact, we thought that on 8th of September when Trump tweeted, we thought that we could completely reset the button and restart again with the precondition that there has to be ceasefire first and then we move on to negotiation. Maybe briefly talk about the scenarios. And this is what my fear is. I see three possible scenarios here happening. The US will sign a deal with the Taliban. Eventually, the Taliban will be incorporated in the Afghan government, whatever that government is going to look like. They will have position, ministerial position, governor's position, and so forth. The assumption is that they will transition to a political force, and there will be election. That is the best scenario. Now, the second scenario is that the US will withdraw. There is no guarantor, and there is no definition of guarantor, and the issue of sanctuaries in Pakistan has not been resolved and has not yet been discussed at all between the US and the Taliban, that they will be incorporated, the Taliban will be incorporated in the Afghan government. They are a cohesive force. We are divisive because a recent election has further divided us. Then they could somehow see a violation of the agreement and then control the entire Afghan government. This is what I personally believe the Taliban strategy is. That once the US withdraw, the Afghan government side is divisive, like Vietnam, will take over in 6 months' time. The third scenario is also a likely scenario, and that is the Taliban will, the political elites will sign a deal, but the commanders on the ground will continue fighting, as we saw in 1992 with Mujahideen. And again, that takes us back to the civil war. In conclusion, the lack of transparency in the process, exclusion of the Afghan government and Afghan people as a whole in this process has been damaging our performance in fighting the Taliban in the last year or so. Election has been divisive, polarized Afghan polity. The issue of guarantor needs to be addressed. Who is going to be guarantor, make sure that, like Cambodia, where there was an agreement with the Chinese that they should not support the Cambodian communists. There should be a guarantor that Pakistan will not continue supporting the Taliban. And finally, the issue of sanctuaries across the border needs to be addressed. Otherwise, to us, this looks very much like a withdrawal agreement, and it would be good to know that this is a withdrawal agreement so that we can realign politically and strategically within the region ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we'll move to our third speaker, Dr. Ibrahimi, who will also use the opportunity to launch the fresh off the press book on Afghanistan. I believe you have flyers for the book, so
yes.
I might circulate them since you're too shy to promote yourself.
Thank you.
I might just, if you don't mind, maybe pass to the other table as well. Thanks. Please.
Thank you, Professor Barzana. Let me begin by saying what a great pleasure it is to share this panel with Professor William Mehdi. I had this honor and privilege of writing this book together with him. I was his PhD student, and it was a great opportunity to have this opportunity to co-author with your mentor, and I was really pleased with that. And also, Dr. Timo Shah, I'm very pleased that he is visiting Australia, and also found the opportunity to come and share his insight with us at Deakin University. Well, I'm going to quickly draw on the book to make a few remarks about why has it been difficult for the Afghan government and the political elites in Kabul to come up with some sort of national team and build a consensus regarding the peace process with the Taliban. And I think Dr. Sharan already mentioned some of the challenges of overcoming divisions. It has come up quite repeatedly when there were these discussions of forming a national team that could represent Afghanistan at the national level in a future negotiation with the Taliban every time that has been falling apart. And I think, drawing on the book, I would like to make a couple of observations on how the post-2001 Afghan state was designed, the institutional structure of the Afghan state, and how it works in practice. Well, the first and most obvious thing, which is probably a well-known fact, but is, I think, relevant for the discussion, is that in 2001, and subsequently in 2004, the Afghan constitution, the state was designed around this idea of a very strong centralized state. I remember myself, I was quite young, but I was following at that time. There was this discussion at that time that it's essentially a form of monarchy. They took the 1964 Afghan constitution, which was essentially in place between December of 2001 when the monarchy was signed and the new constitution was designed. Except the chapter on monarchy, everything was the same thing. But the new constitution created this highly centralized presidential system where the president has the power to essentially appoint not only the ministers and the governor, but also officials at the district level. And we know from a lot of political science literature, comparative politics, that presidential systems have got a number of problems. Those kind of problems can be particularly serious in places like Afghanistan, which are disrupted by years of war and instability. Obviously, the concentration of power in one office has a tendency towards political gridlocks, a tendency towards authoritarianism, and a tendency to make election into zero-sum game, where the winner can claim to take all that is coming out of the election. And in practice, the focus on the central institutions of the state in Kabul also meant that there was not much attention paid for it in the initial first few years of the intervention to support and promote local government at the district and provincial level. So as a result of this, we there was this massive vacuum created at the subnational level, which was providing quite a conducive opportunity for the Taliban to recruit and mobilize and take care of the territories. So while formally the Afghan state was designed on this idea of a strong centralized presidential system, but in effect the president who took the office, President Hamid Karzai, from 2001 up to 2014, lacked a lot of the capabilities and instruments that he could use to enforce his authority across the country. So as a result of this, what he did was he tried to use the resources and the patronage which came with the holding such a highly centralized state to build alliances and maintain alliances through distribution of patronage, which includes the possession of authority in the state, but also often informal forms of patronage and distribution of resources to people and groups they were supporting him. So as a result of this, what has emerged in Afghanistan is a highly centralized presidential system on the paper, which is a form of neo-patrimonialism. So in neo-patrimonialism, there's a lot of literature on that from different countries, but essentially is a system, a hybrid system in which paternalistic rule grounded in patron-client relations is intertwined with the formal structures and bureaucracy of the state. So whoever comes to the power, there's also a lot of personal relationship and patron-client ties, which are often forming the basis of power relations among the Afghan elite networks. And that has a number of key implications, which I outline quite quickly. In the first, that there is always a huge gap between how the state is supposed to work and function and the reality in which the way it works in Afghanistan. And secondly, it also creates a high level of impunity for people who have access to the president, but it is based on relations of personal trust and power. And thirdly, it is also creating a tendency where the aid and the state resources go to the people who have the right connections instead of people who have the highest level of needs. So as a result of this, over the past 18, 19 years, there's a very high level of accumulation of grievances and disconnect between the system and the people. And because, again, every time the power is so much concentrated in the office of the president, and every time the contest for the who holds the office is hugely important for the next 5 years. So as a result of this, every time there is a presidential election, we have a crisis. In 2014, that crisis was only resolved through the formation of a national unity government, and now we have another election which was held in September of 2019, and still the results are not announced, partially because of the stakes are too high and who controls that office in such a critical period of time in the history of Afghanistan. So let me maybe conclude with a couple of quick points on what does it mean for the peace process. And I think the first and most obvious thing is elite fragmentation. And even though various Afghan groups, political groups, they have very high stake in negotiation process with the Taliban, not least their own positions of influence in the Afghan government, but they are finding it very hard to build a national team of negotiation, a consensus, which is again coming back to this whole idea of personal patron-client relationship, because institutions as institutions are not working, that is very, very difficult to come up with a national team to negotiate a Taliban. And at the same time, while I think what I outlined is explaining the challenges and fragility of the Afghan state in dealing with the Taliban. And I think the Afghan people as a society has been changing quite significantly, which is, I think, capturing this idea of what we see as globalizing the state in our book as well. Over time, over the past 18, 19 years now, the Afghan society has moved forward, and that there is a huge value conflict between what could be a Taliban-style emirate in Afghanistan and what the people want. Again, I would like to quote a couple of findings from the Asia Foundation Survey of the Afghan People, which came out in 2019, which is quite, I think, interesting. The survey shows that there is a lot of frustration and low level of trust with the Afghan electoral institutions, quite understandably, with the Afghan, some formal institutions. But the level of satisfaction with the Afghan democracy remains quite high. 65% of people from across the country, cities and villages express satisfaction with democracy, with the simple idea of having the opportunity to elect who's going to rule the country. And similarly, 76% of the respondents of the survey support women's right to work outside their homes. I think this is a huge change in a country like Afghanistan. And 86% of the people also support women's education. So I think this is, to sum up, I think there is these challenges of building a national negotiation team to be led by the Afghan government, but at the same time, you have got these huge changes in the society, which are going to have huge ramifications for any sort of peace deal with the Taliban.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sticking with the time, all three speakers. Now, this gives us ample time for Q&A and for reflections. The floor is open. If you have any burning question, now's the time to raise it. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thanks to all the speakers. A question to Professor Maleh. Don't you think that the too much of this dialogue happening is also not very helpful? So there are peace dialogues hosted by Pakistan, and Iran has been also negotiating with the Taliban, Russia, US, China. Don't you think there's too much of that happening, which is counterproductive?
Look, it can be. It will depend to some degree upon what the objectives are of the different hosts for such dialogues and who the participants might be. And as you say, there's a lot going on at the moment, and it's quite difficult to know exactly what is happening in the course of that. There's a large literature on what's been called track 2 diplomacy, which is concerned with bringing together people who are not agents of the state as a way of generating ideas that might then be fed through to state-level actors to ensure that, for example, the agenda of a state-to-state or state-to-state aspirant actor doesn't omit some crucial issue that really should be taken into account. So when the Bonn Conference on Afghanistan was held back in November, December 2001, that resulted in the Bonn Agreement that then laid out the tracks for political change in Afghanistan, there was a parallel Afghan civil society conference that was supported by Swiss Peace at the instigation of the German government just down the hill from the Petersburg where the main meeting was held, in order to try to generate ideas that could be then fed through the United Nations into the discussions that were taking place between the Afghan actors that had been recruited to it. So that was an example of a useful exercise because it was concerned with ensuring that the agenda for discussion at the main meeting that was going to produce an agreement between the different actors was more richly informed about what sorts of issues might need to be taken into account. But track 2 processes could go wrong. They can actually fuel antagonism if people who are not committed to the process are invited and end up seeing it as a new platform on which to voice their hostility to other players. Whether that's actually happened, I'm not sure at the moment, but one would need to approach that kind of engagement carefully in order that it be a constructive contributor to a process rather than something which is destructive and fueling antagonism between different groups.
Yes. Well, thank you everyone for very interesting presentations. My question is actually mostly directed to Dr. Shara and maybe Professor Maleh as well. I can ask Ibrahim Saib anytime we see him every day. I want to get your opinions. If you want to play a bit of like a devil's advocate, why should the Taliban actually go through the channels that you're offering to go through the government, thinking that, well, okay, we have the Americans coming to us, perhaps asking us to sign a withdrawal agreement. The government, both the leaders of the national unity, together combined got less than 1.5 million of votes during the democratic elections. And when they want to send delegations to the meetings, they send 250 people, which Taliban, they mock, they say it's not a wedding invitation. So why should the Taliban actually come and sit, negotiate with the government that absolutely has, its power over its people has decreased. It has over 65% of dependency on foreign aid. Corruption is very, very high. Over 60,000 people of the Afghan National Defense Force have died in fighting with the Taliban. So why should they do that? What kind of negotiation would that put them if they think that, yes, okay, let's do that the way you want me to do?
That's actually a very good question. Thank you. Now, let's not take a devil's advocate, but actually discuss realities in terms of those are some of the realities on the ground. But I would frame it differently to what you have framed. Let's not forget that in 2019, early 2019, there was a consultative Loya Jirga Ground Assembly of Afghans in Kabul, elected representative at the district level came to Kabul and provided a framework for the Afghan government. And again, who that Afghan administration is going to be post-election. There is a framework by the Afghan people about the way forward and the red lines. And the red lines are very clear in terms of vulnerable groups' rights, women's rights, the kind of state structure, political system we want, and so forth. That Loya Jirga, for us, is the roadmap through which we want to negotiate with the Taliban. Okay? The people, for so many reasons, did not come out to vote. Okay? But as we see statistics here, there might be a lot of discrepancies against some of the political elites. And again, 65% of Afghanistan is young, and our political elites are old. I think there is a clear message coming from the younger generation by not going and voting this time, saying that you do not represent us. And I think that's the key point here, that the Taliban does not represent. The Taliban that I have met in Doha, they're all 65 plus. They do not represent the younger generation of combatants. Our elites does not represent the younger generation like yourself, me, and significant number of Afghans who are the backbone of Afghan civil society, bureaucracy, civil service, media, and so forth. They're not representing the realities of 2020 Afghanistan. So that's the kind of message I would get from this election. I wouldn't say that this is not legitimate. What I would argue instead is that there was a significant unity in Doha, whether they were within the administration or outside as opposition among the political elite. There are values within the constitutions that we have, that the post-2001 elites are committed to. Okay? Safeguarding those values within the constitutions, those red lines within the constitution. There are differences, and that's the beauty of living in a democracy. Okay? But there is a general consensus, even among the elites. This is where I disagree with Ibrahim a little bit, that there is this fragmentation. I think when it comes to the core values, and that is around the constitution, the elites are united. But who would represent us is a key question, and that's where I would argue that we need a broad-based negotiating team that would go and represent the Afghans who have risked their lives around this constitution. Okay? And with that, there will be not just one team, there will be several teams. There will be a negotiating team, there will be a council of political elites representing all sorts of the Afghan community who would oversee the negotiation process from the Afghan side. There will be technical team, probably 3 or 4 technical teams that actually will feed in, will go to those negotiations and will help the negotiation. Let's not forget, the Taliban have received significant training on negotiation skills by our international partners, Western countries, and they're still receiving significant training on the type of political system they want and so forth.
Just a couple of quick points in response to your question. On the issue of elections, the difficulty that arises is that voting is not compulsory in Afghanistan, and there were extremely florid and violent threats made by the Taliban against people going out to vote. I was an observer of the presidential election in September. Our team of 4 from Australia were the only foreign observers there, and it was very clear that even people who went out to vote were very apprehensive about spending any great length of time in the vicinity of the polling place in case there was some kind of attack that occurred. And they were, it was perfectly understandable that parents did not want their children to go and vote in case somebody who was the future social security of the family might get wiped out in a bombing attack. In other cases, I came across members of a family who were committed to voting went out one by one rather than in a group to the polling place in case a Taliban bombing were to wipe out the whole generation of people who would look after the children. So the threats to the livelihood of voters were very great indeed, and it then becomes very difficult to work out exactly what element of the low turnout reflected just a general disposition not to get involved in politics, what reflected a sense of disgruntlement with the performance of the candidates who were on offer, and what simply represented fear about what the consequences might be if one went out to vote. The other point I'd like to make, and it sort of leads into this whole issue of what is an intra-Afghan dialogue. Because certainly the Taliban have had a small negotiating team at Doha. But the question that then arises is, who would that team be able to bind to the terms of an agreement? Because you've got the negotiators in Doha, you then have other power centers. You have the Quetta Shura, you have the Peshawar Shura, you have the Mashhad Shura in Iran, and then you have ISIS as an unconnected actor which has certainly been powerful enough to cause misery to lots of ordinary people, which is highly unlikely to be bound by any kind of agreements that might be struck in Doha by a team from the Taliban. The idea of an intra-Afghan dialogue has been around at least since 1991, when the UN Secretary General at the time put it forward in a proposal about how to move forward when the communist regime was still in place. But no one has, at least to my satisfaction, come up with any more detail to explain what an intra-Afghan dialogue might be, how the pitfalls associated with it might be overcome. The very idea of representation is itself an elusive one with many different strands in political theory. Hunter Pittman published a very good book in 1967 called The Concept of Representation that traced just in Western political theory different models of a representative as a delegate, a representative as a trustee. There are all sorts of issues about what we mean by representation which haven't even begun to be addressed as far as an intra-Afghan dialogue in which the entire population obviously can't participate, would need to be taken into account. So, in a way, I think the difficulty, for example, of putting together a small delegation to represent the Afghan government in discussions is partly a reflection of how much more pluralistic politics has become in Afghanistan in the last 20 years than it would have been in the past. And one of the prices of a more pluralistic politics is that there are more people who seriously want to ensure that their voices are not neglected in the negotiation process because of a suspicion that a very narrowly based negotiating team might say, oh well, there are some things we can sell out, women's rights, minorities' rights, all sorts of things like that, and we'll get a nice agreement and then everything will turn to custard.
So 2 questions. Perhaps you could ask your questions together and then the panel will respond.
I was going to ask, in Afghanistan, is there enough of a developed civil society that it would actually pose a serious threat to an Islamist Taliban government in the future? if the Taliban came and created their own political mechanism, is there actually enough of a civil society that it could offer any organized resistance socially?
And then we'll take the second question.
Quick question, thank you very much. Assume that if the US keep sidelining the Afghan government, and then the result is kinds of political collapse in Kabul, and this couldn't make some sort of consensus on to do the Taliban. So there's any possibility to avoid the collapse of security forces, to avoid any kinds of takeover by the Taliban if they intra-Afghan dialogue?
Yeah, published on this.
Well, in fact, January last year, we published a report together with Dr. C.J. Postprofessor Chris of Wells and Nematollah Vision, who is now at ANU, a report about social movements in Afghanistan. I think it was published as a special report by the USIP. If you're interested, you can have a look at it. Over the past 5-6 years, Afghanistan has also seen an upsurge of civil society and social movement activism. And this is, I think, part of the reason we also talk about democratization in Afghanistan. Because in the 1990s, there was like some form of civil society activism, which was, during the Taliban, which was essentially eliminated. There might be people who might be doing everyday form of resistance, we might call it, but there was nothing in terms of like organized activism. But over the past 18 years, there's a new generation of Afghans, both inside Afghanistan but also outside Afghanistan, who have got both the capacity and the resources and the skills to mobilize on a grand scale. Some of these groups are able to bring in like tens of thousands of people from time to time, and there are people that are active in civil society, NGOs, media, and all of those areas. But at the same time, I think there are some hope that this is like, if given the space, this form of civil society forces can lead to broader changes in the Afghan government, in politics, as well as people are some moving from civil society to the government. They tend to be a lot more efficient, more committed, more principled, and they drive change in other sectors of the society as well. However, I think given the recent developments we have seen across the world, we had a discussion with Bill the other day, civil societies also can be quite fragile. They are dependent on this communication infrastructure, for example, like the internet, access to Facebook and Twitter. And as we have seen in India, in Kashmir, in Iran more recently, and this kind of resources can also be taken away quite easily. So I think civil society on its own is probably not the solution if the overall political and security framework is not in place for them to operate.
Let me just quickly add on that. As I said earlier, last year alone, in the last 2 years, we have recruited 500,000 younger Afghans into the bureaucracy. The backbone of the Afghan bureaucracy, civil service, NDSF, media, they're all younger Afghan post-2001 generation that has been educated abroad, come back and helping the country to develop. So that's a significant force, not only within the state itself, but also outside. But as the fear would be, if the Taliban are given the Ministry of Telecommunication, they can always, as you said, cut off the internet and so forth, which would have an impact in their ability of civil society to mobilize. But again, that's not where my fear is. As Bill pointed out, we're proud to be in a multi-polar political system where the rules of the games have been clearly defined, and there has been no attempt by violent groups, elites within Afghanistan, to fracture the state at all. Now I'll come to the second question, which is elites and its impact on NDSF, our security forces. No, I don't agree with you on that fragmentation of elite. There has been fragmentation before. 2014 was a good example of it. The Afghan state has come under immense strain and pressure, but the elites have kept their cohesiveness despite differences. But let's not forget, in terms of cohesion of the central command within the NDSF, both the army, the intelligence, and the police, reforms in the last 2 years has been significant. And I have attended on a daily basis Ministry of Defense security briefings, and from my own assessment, things have improved significantly. Let's not remember that we had the height of the war, we had more than 140,000 international troops in the country. Now that their operation, their ability to operate is minimum a couple of thousand in the country. The burden is on Afghan army and the police, and they have performed significantly despite the sacrifices that we have. As I said, more than 25 international terrorist organizations operating in Afghanistan, including ISIS, Taliban, again different factions of Taliban have been receiving significant help from sanctuaries across the border. Despite all of that and the sacrifices that we have seen, the central command within the army and police have been cohesive. In terms of our performance, let's not forget that in the last 18 years, the Taliban has not been able to withhold. There has been 2 times that cities have collapsed, but they have not been able to withhold a city more than a day or 2. That's one point. So their ability to withhold a province is almost 0. And in the last election, in every other election, by the way, there was a backdoor, back-channel agreement that the Taliban would not attack significantly polling stations and so forth, but this time was different. This time there was no agreement. The Taliban wanted to weaken us significantly politically, therefore they did not allow a significant part of our population across the country to come out and vote. But again, our forces were capable of and performed magnificently in terms of enabling elections to happen. Let us not forget that with the loss that we have, no army in the world, if it has a loss of around 20,000 per year, would sustain itself. No country. But Afghan state, this army has been able to sustain itself and has been able to recruit continuously. And that shows the commitment of a significant part of the Afghan population to fight for this constitution, for the value system that we have.
Well, there are, I'm sure, many other questions. I haven't asked any of my questions yet, but I'm delighted to say that our panel is going to stick around. We are having lunch outside, so there's opportunity for more questions and discussions. So thank you very much for visiting us from Canberra, from Kabul, and from Building C. Wonderful to have you. Really enjoyed the conversation, and best of luck with the book sale. I hope you get good reviews. I'm sure you will get good reviews for the book. It's mandatory reading now. You have the order form circulating, so all the best. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.